Hello again, to whom it may concern. I am Anna-Louise Rothschild, the last elite of the hidden power. It is the third day of the 8th week, 250 Ordo at Chaos, and this is my second personal log. It is difficult to accept what has happened to us in the time since the 5th year of Ordo at Chaos, when we quashed the last organized resistance in the United States. At that time, the elite numbered in the hundreds, as can be surmised by the massive base that has become my lonely domicile. The close of the previous age, known as Anno Domini, had occurred about 2035 years after it began. What was ushered in after was the beginning of the human purge, which was an incremental downsizing of the world population through a variety of different methods. The primary means of the purge was mass starvation, accomplished through a combination of manufactured economic catastrophes and rigid environmental regulations, backed by the enforcement of well-indoctrinated policemen, many of them mercenaries, but most were comprised of woefully deluded American patriots, fueled by well-placed propaganda about an emerging threat of world conflict. This period of economic strife was ushered in, as all other hidden power efforts, incrementally, going back more than 100 years before the close of Anno Domini. But the turmoil peaked somewhere between 2015 and 2019 Anno Domini. What followed was 16 years of economic depression and food shortages, which, when coupled with years of war, civil unrest, and a decline in procreation amongst most peoples, as instilled by the media, spelled the end of the so-called Covenant of Nations, and ushered in the tyranny of the New Order. The key component to the initial success of the new system was the power of surveillance, which was most heavily concentrated in the cities. At this point, 2/3 of the remaining population still dwelled in metropolitan areas, and were thus easily transferred to the internment camps or purged afterward, through poisoning of the water supply. Greater challenges emerged in the rural areas, where people were more self-sufficient, and a trend of resistance emerged thanks to the effort of covenant keepers. Many who would otherwise not have allied with each other, began to form militias and sought to counter our efforts. The greatest hindrance came at the formation of one particular group, known as the Keepers of the Oath. They were comprised mostly of policemen and former military members, and upon our initial efforts to arrest all rural dissidents, stood down and refused to follow orders, and turned on those who attempted to implement our plan. Most of the initial bloodshed on our side was contained to lower-level subordinates, but disaster struck when a member of the elite, and a member of my own ancestry, Jonathan Maynard Rothschild, converted to Christianity, and outed several of our bases, resulting in the deaths of several dozen elites. Several years of conflict followed, until finally at the close of 2035 Anno Domini, the last major city was fully emptied, and the final goal of a 500 million world population was reached. This is what marked the beginning of the current age, known as Ordo at Chaos. In its beginnings, this age was marked by continuing efforts by covenant keepers to liberate the internment camps. Some initial successes were made, as several camps, comprised mainly of women such as Venus 81, in Columbus, Ohio, and Venus 19, in Eden, Texas. Although the total women liberated numbered a couple of thousand, it was more than enough to form a viable society to counter our own, and none of these prisoners were ever reclaimed. Later, about 14 weeks into the 5th year of Ordo at Chaos, the initial soldier caste of our robotic enforcers was perfected, and most of the camps were fully transitioned out of faulty human hands and into that of a stronger and more reliable force. Since then, every covenant keeper attempt at liberating the remaining camps failed, and like the parasitic rats that they were, they began moving around the now abandoned cities and towns, scavenging for their means of survival. Though it seemed that our new order had wholly prevailed, covenant keeper attacks were then visited upon the elite themselves, incrementally, in much the same way that we had implemented our efforts. One by one, members of our class were assassinated while moving from one camp to another to oversee the policing of the workers. It was in the year 72, Ordo at Chaos, that Oppenheimer perfected the artificial intelligence software protocols, which began the transition away from our oversight, as our numbers were dwindling, to that of the newly born robot elite. This was done primarily to secure our safety, as Covenant Keeper attacks had reduced our numbers down to 250, eradicating 2 of the primary elite families. It was then that the elite began a perpetual hermitage in underground bases, such as the one I am now located in, and were obligated only to observe the enforcement of our laws from the newly constructed satellite feeds. Although our safety from Covenant Keeper attacks was finally assured, sadly, we remained unprotected from the will of fate, as our numbers continued to decrease during the next 120 years. Few heirs were procreated to retain the human heritage of the elite, and eventually the parochial nature of our order gave way to incestuous relations. By the time that we had reached the 3rd century of Ordo at Chaos, only 66 remained, and of those only a handful had not been rendered sterile by the will of their parents' blood relation to each other. So it was determined that, in lieu of our lack of hope, we would again move freely from base to base, often making stops in some of the cities to check for surviving savages, who may have been used to repopulate the elite. However, these searches were to no avail, and eventually the Covenant Keepers began learning our patterns of travel, and the attacks upon us began anew. Before long, the elite numbered less than 20, which was at around the time that I, the last-born elite of the Hidden Power, was conceived. My parents, who were first cousins, attempted to conceive again after my birth, but to no avail. So it was decided that my education would consist solely in the programming and maintenance of our android counterparts. My efforts, upon my ascension into adulthood, were to be the last chance at a new beginning, for the Hidden Power. Perhaps at some future date I will tell you, be you friend or foe, what my purpose was. But for now, I am content to know that be it our fate to live on, as metallic shells of our former selves through our robotkin, or to rise again, that the human race will never be free to have liberty of conscience, and that their fictional god will no longer be free to temper or influence this world. Thus ends the 2nd log of Anna-Louise Rothschild, the last elite of the Hidden Power.